We continue our look at fallacies of relevance with another category of something we call red herrings. Now, there's some dispute as to what the origin of that phrase actually is. But one thought is that criminals would sometimes use herrings, which is a type of fish, to throw off the scent of dogs that the police were using to chase them. Herrings, when they go bad or spoiled, turn this kind of reddish brown color. And so the criminals would just toss these red herrings out to throw the dogs off their scent. Now, I have to say, before we go any further with this, when I hear the word herring, I always think of a particular scene from a comedic movie called Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail. Some of you may have seen this. It's a classic comedy movie about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and their search for the Holy Grail. And in this scene that you're about to watch, King Arthur and his knights have come across some other very strange knights who present them with a rather odd task.
You must cut down the mightiest tree in the forest with a herring. We shall do no such thing. Oh, please.
Now, the first of our red herrings is a fallacy that we call the appeal to ignorance. And this is one where basically people are saying, you can't prove me wrong, so therefore I must be right. This is a very weak argument, the appeal to ignorance. And there's a couple of different versions of how the appeal to ignorance can work. And we're going to take a look at that right now with our favorite characters, Logic Dragon and Kangaroo. Here's Logic Dragon saying, well, how can you say that unicorns don't exist? And Kangaroo says, well, unicorns do not exist because there is absolutely no evidence that they do. Of course, our little unicorn down here in the corner is thinking, well, what am I, chopped liver? Now, what Kangaroo should have said was that there is no evidence yet that they exist. If you think about it, at one time there was no evidence for atoms, right? There was no evidence for subatomic particles, there was no evidence for black holes, and yet we now have found evidence to back up the theory that these things actually exist. So the argument from ignorance, or the appeal to ignorance, really is no argument at all, because it could simply mean you just haven't found the evidence yet. Now, there's another version of this that really is even weaker than the one we just saw. Here, Kangaroo is replying back to Logic Dragon, and she says, well, why do you think that unicorns do exist? And Logic Dragon says, well, that's simple. Unicorns must exist because there is no evidence that they do not. And once again, little unicorn is thinking, does no one look at the bottom of these cartoons? Now, this is particularly weak because it's almost impossible to prove that there's no evidence anywhere that something does not exist. Right? Trying to prove a universal negative like that is almost an impossible task. And there's an interesting parallel here in law, the practice of law. You may have heard this expression before, but the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. There's a wonderful Latin expression, Onus Pro Bondi. Onus Pro Bondi. The Onus Pro Bondi literally means the burden of proof. The burden of proof in a law case lies with the prosecution, the side that is saying you have done something wrong. That's the side that must prove the case. The prosecution has to be able to prove that you committed the crime. You don't have to prove that you didn't. Okay? The burden of proof does not lie with the defense. And that's because, really, of this appeal to ignorance. It's very difficult to prove that something is not the case. Okay? So the appeal to ignorance is a particularly weak argument, and it's one of our red herrings. Now, another of the red herring fallacies is what we call irrelevant goals or functions. Take a look at this example with a couple of our clip art characters. The girl in gold says, "Why are you wasting your time with Latin and logic? Those subjects will never help you earn a six-figure salary." And the fellow in green says, "Well, you may be right, but that isn't why I'm studying them." The thing about the irrelevant goals and functions is that this fallacy focuses on something that really wasn't the purpose of whatever was being talked about in the first place. You see, with the girl in gold, she's trying to make the argument against studying Latin and logic, but her rationale is that such subjects will never help you earn a lot of money. Well, that wasn't the purpose of those subjects anyhow. That wasn't why the fellow in green was studying them. Maybe he was studying Latin and logic simply because he enjoyed them or because he wanted to become a more well-rounded human being. So she's trying to make the argument based on a goal that wasn't even a goal of the fellow in green in the first place. Now, I want to take just a little sidebar here and talk a moment about relationships. Yeah, relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, friend relationships, any kind of relationship that you have. Be careful that you're not looking for an irrelevant goal or function from that relationship. Sometimes we expect more from another person than really we have a right to. In fact, we know that God has placed the desire for Him deep in our hearts. And sometimes we will try to fulfill some deep longing through the person of somebody else. Maybe we expect something from a brother or sister or a friend that really is something that only God can fulfill. So irrelevant goals and functions, while that's one of our informal fallacies here, it's a red herring when it comes to logic, that also applies in our relationships as well.